War of 1812. This one particular battle, the American forces captured 6 artillery pieces, but because of wounds and such like that, casualties, they pulled back. They neglected to take the cannon with them. So the British took the cannon. So at this particular point, even to this day, both sides are arguing who won. They fell back to Fort Erie, and for the balance of the year, they controlled Fort Erie. The British made several attempts to take that fort. So eventually, the Americans pulled back across the river. At the Battle of Chippewa, one of our better generals was wounded. That was General Winfred Scott. He was seriously wounded and taken back to Philadelphia to recuperate after he had stopped in Williamsville and in Batavia, and then again in Canandaigua and Albany. It actually took him about 8 months to get back to Philadelphia. So that's pretty much what's going on in this area. Now up along the Lake Champlain, the British, they remembered that we tried to attack from that general area, so they decided to come down the lake. They figured if they could take the lake, they could control the Hudson River and split the Americans in half. At Plattsburgh, the British had a fleet of ships. They actually had 8 ships. The Americans had 6. The Americans actually put their ships across the bay there at Plattsburgh. The British came at them. They lost. They realized they didn't have the naval forces to back them up. They went back to Canada. And that pretty much ended what happened in New York for the whole rest of the war. Now the war shifts south. Now is when we start talking about the burning of Washington, the bombardment at Fort McHenry, the various attacks along the entire coastline. We all know that we won at Fort McHenry. There was one battle at Bladensburg that is referred to nowadays as the Bladenburg races, because there again, the militia broke ranks and ran when the British forces came at them. The British forces then went on to Washington, where they burned the President's Mansion. It wasn't known as the White House yet. The Treasury Building, and attempted to burn the Capitol Building. This was all in retaliation for when, back in 1812, we invaded and burned the city of York, which was the capital of Upper Canada. York is what we now call Toronto. So at that point, the war now shifts again to the Gulf region. General Jackson is now fortifying the city of New Orleans. Now, in the meantime, we have our diplomats are trying to come to an agreeable conclusion to the war. They're going through discussions in Ghent. And what happened was they finally came to an agreement, and the agreement basically was, we're going to stop fighting. The British were tired because they were fighting actually 2 wars at this time. They were still fighting Napoleon. They had just beaten Napoleon. So now those troops are getting ready to come over to the Americas to fight. So we decide that we're ready to not give up, but negotiate. So the negotiations worked out to, we give back what we took from you, you give back to us what you took from us. And essentially that's how the war ended. At this time, the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814. However, it takes a while to get the information across the ocean. On January 8th, the British troops attack General Jackson's forces outside of the city of New Orleans. At that point, the British attacked with over 5,000 troops. They had approximately 2,000 casualties in that battle. The Americans had approximately 1,700 across the barricades, 59 casualties on the American side. However, this is January 8th, 2015, or 1815. At this point, the battle actually occurred afterwards. Now, we still have our ships out to sea. They don't know the war's over until they get into a port. So the American naval forces actually defeat 3 more British men of war after the war ended. Now, in reenacting, we have a joke about who won the war. The Americans think they won the war. The Canadians know they won the war. The British say, what war? That's all I have to say here. If anybody's got some questions, I can try and answer them. Also, I have up here typically what a militiaman was issued if he didn't take his own weapon. So you feel free to come up here and look at this stuff here too. So, any questions?
During the War of 1812, they used where Tops Plaza is in Hilton. That was 10 foot lower than the road than it is now. And they used that as a training ground for the War of 1812.
Yeah, I know some of the regulars from Sackett's Harbor and from Fort Ontario Oswego, they came to the Niagara region by way of the ridge. They didn't call it Ridge Road. They called it the Ridge. So that would make sense that they would stop there, do some training before they continued on.
And then General Braddock's came into Braddock's Bay, I believe. I don't know a lot of information, maybe somebody else.
It was a General Prideaux, I think was his name. But they didn't know how to pronounce that name. Even though there was a General Braddock's who did fight on, but he never landed in Braddock's.
Yeah.
It was General Prideaux, and they didn't know how to pronounce it, and they finally wound up saying Braddock's. And that's a fact.
I know that at the beginning of the war, a lot of the generals were holdovers from the Revolutionary War. And that's one of the reasons why things were going so poorly at first. They just weren't good at it. West Point, military academy at West Point was just becoming into existence just before the war started. So that we didn't have the trained officer corps that eventually we developed. So a lot of the battles were fought on our side by people that didn't know what they were doing. Unfortunately, the British, they had been fighting a war against the French for long enough. Their troops were fairly well trained. So that was why one of the dastardly things that we Americans did, both in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, is we tended to shoot at the officers and the NCOs. Because if you can get rid of the command structure, the troops typically were not disciplined enough to be able to continue. Now, actually, I'll have to say, speaking from personal experience and kind of proud of the fact, is that's one of the strong points of the American military now, is that we have a fairly intelligent enlisted group that can work on their own without immediate supervision. So,
I read several years ago that the Lake Ontario and Lake Erie action during the War of 1812 was rather lackadaisical.
Yes.
There was too much commerce going on. And the business people were upset their commerce was being disturbed.
yeah, that's true. And also, it wasn't just on the lakes. Most of the troops actually came from the frontier. Very few troops came from the New England states. Actually, up in the New York, in the Vermont area, New Yorkers and Vermonters were the primary supply source of beef for the British. Now, in the New England states, they complained a lot about losing their ships and their sail, but they complained even more about not being able to sail. So they were not in favor of the war. So they did everything they could. They refused to send troops. Actually, at one point, they had a convention. They were going to secede from the Confederation of States. The convention was held in Delaware, and believe it or not, it wasn't until after the Battle of New Orleans that they decided that they didn't want to continue with that action. So the business people, for the most part, were against the war, even though they were profiting from it.
Can you tell us about the two battles in Sackett's Harbor?
Yeah, the battles of Sackett's Harbor, there again, like I said, they didn't want to commit their fleets to each other. But the British knew that we were actually building a 120-gun ship at Sackett's Harbor. And so they wanted to come take the supplies and everything. The first battle of Sackett's Harbor, they came ashore at Horse Island, came across, and then advanced on the fort itself. Now the fort itself, I don't know how many of you have been up to Sackett's Harbor State Park. The park itself is relatively small. What most people don't realize is the fort itself actually extended to the south about a mile. So we had a lot of militia troops were there. There was a Marine garrison there. The 3rd U.S. Artillery was stationed there. So there was quite a few troops there. So at that battle, they came in, they advanced through the fort up to what we now refer to as the Commandant's house, essentially right into the village of Sackett's Harbor for the most part. And they were heading for the warehouses. So Commodore Chansey's brother had been given orders to, if it looked like the British were going to get the supplies, he was to fire the supplies. Well, when the British got into what we refer to as Fort Tompkin, he thought that they were going to continue on. He fired the supplies and 2 of the boats that were being built. The Americans held tough and they pushed them back. So technically the British won, even though they ran away. The second battle was pretty much the same type of a thing. There were fairly active fighting going on in the perimeter of the fort, but that first battle was the only time they really got into the major part of the fort itself. Now, if you go into Sackett's Harbor, there is an old cemetery there that has the graves of several 1812 soldiers, including General Zebulon Pike. He was killed at the Battle of York when a magazine blew up, and he was killed by some boulders that landed on top of him as he was trying to shelter 2 British wounded soldiers. Zebulon Pike was also an explorer. You've all heard of Pike's Peak? He was the first one to see it and name it. So, the Army did quite a bit of exploring at that point.
Any other questions? Well, Rick, thank you so much. One of the things I forgot to mention is April's meeting is also our annual meeting. So if anyone here is really anxious to serve on the board or be an officer, we will be electing then, so let us know. All right. One of the things we do, Rick, is ask our speaker to draw our 50-50 winner. So,
I'm not in there, so this is legal.
all right. And tonight, the 50-50 pot is $62.
Oh, wow.
Okay, winning ticket, 479636. All right. You can pick up over there at the table. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Rick. It was more than I ever knew about the War of 1812. So really appreciate it, and we're glad you're part of Churchville. It's okay.